And then Kristen will give me the high sign and tell me when we're live. I can see we're streaming on YouTube, so looks good. Okay.
Yeah, we're good.
Thanks, Kristen. Okay, let's get started. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming on a Friday afternoon, and I will turn it over to Paul.
Okay, thank you, folks. As I had mentioned last time, we're approaching wrapping this up. The thing that I would like to do is make sure that we get the phasing in a sequence and in a set of individual quantities that are palatable to you, meaning it's easiest, obviously, to phase everything in one phase and just count what that costs. It's harder to break it into pieces, but that is the reality that many libraries face. One thing that we'll look at, and I had sent you a copy of this ahead of time just so you could glance at it, but as you get further out to a third or fourth phase, it becomes almost impossible to try and break out costs and further things beyond that, because at some point that is so far into the future that any number you put out there is almost made up, because you don't have any idea what inflation might be or how things might be combined at a later date. But what I did is, from my professional experience and with Lisa's input, she can't be here this afternoon, I wanted to show you a breakdown that is similar to some things we've discussed, and I think it should give us a talking point, and we can add or take from it as necessary, but I think it gives us a way to think about the project. So I just hit share screen. Do you have the plan in front of you then?
We do.
Yep.
And forgive me, I work on a laptop. I don't have the graphics machine that Lisa and Megan and so forth have, but I tried to summarize this in a way that made color coding easy, and then we'll tie to the cost estimating as well. What I'm suggesting, and I think this is consistent with our previous conversations, is that phase one, because it has the largest impact by adding the large meeting room and gives us not only something that the community has been asking for right up front, that is additional meeting space and larger meeting space, but it also gives us a staging area for when we do other things. We can move things into this space on a temporary basis while we do renovations elsewhere. So it makes a lot of sense to include this. Per the last conversation, I increased the drawing part is the same, but you see the shaded value here. I increased the capacity of that meeting room by enlarging it so that we can get a crowd of 200 into that meeting room. It's actually 196, but 200 people, which does, of course, make the addition larger, but you can see we can fit that fairly easily on the site and still have the amenities and the other pieces that we had talked about. It's not a one-to-one correspondence of seats per square feet. When we add, we can lengthen the rows, which does not necessarily lengthen all the aisles, for example, and that still gives us plenty of room. So in this phase, what I had anticipated was renovations and changes to the lobby area here to access where that door is and that entrance space, and these pieces that include storage, an ADA restroom, a kitchenette, and of course this addition. I also included in this first phase the reworking of the plaza, because it's problematic now and because it's likely that it could be disrupted or damaged during the construction of this addition. And so as we go down through the slides, when we get to the cost budgeting for phase one, you'll see that it is the large meeting room, it is the site work related to the plaza and the area around the large meeting room, as well as some renovations on the interior at the lobby, and then it's also the vestibule down on Delaware. All of that constitutes a phase one, and we'll come back to it, but I just want to walk you through the thinking there. Phase 2A, and I made 2A and 2B because they are essentially, they can be switched. You could do 2B first, or you could do 2A first, depending on the priority. But 2A as a description is essentially all of the site work changes that we talked about, including the one-way entries, the introduction of the book and circulation transaction window, as well as the pass around, the transition to one-way traffic, going clockwise around the site, and modifications to the planting areas and sidewalks. It also includes the small addition, a little over 1,300 square feet, that infills the space where we have the book drop room, or the circ window room, and an extended maintenance and storage area. That could be 2A or it could be 2B. I'm calling it 2A in this particular instance. We'll come back to it. 2B, which could be before that or after that, keep in mind this large meeting room and this component is part of phase 1. This is part of the other phase 2 piece that we just talked about. Phase 2B would be the introduction of an additional conference room, the changes to the lobby and improvements, circulation, new and popular and quick browse, as well as some office spaces, small meeting room, and staff and circ and back of house areas. This is sort of the core area of the library, and I broke out 2B because it makes that first impression. It's an area that would instantly add, again, more meeting space and improve staff conditions throughout, but it is something that should follow not too far after the curbside pickup transaction window, if that one came first, because it does make the connection a little more palatable there. Phase 3 then is essentially the balance of the renovations. Now, I made a mistake in the graphic. This shaded area should also come over into this the existing meeting room and the new program conference room we created down here in these restrooms. I did include that in the budget numbers for these areas. The graphic, I didn't include the shading over here. So I'll fix that before it's a final graphic. But I wanted to give you a sense then of a phase 1, 2A, 2B, and a phase 3. We've broken it into 4 phases. And this last phase, in essence, is the balance of the project. That's not to say it does have to all be done at once. You could, for example, break out the children's library and the teen space and do that as a phase 3, and then do the rest of this as phase 4. There is some value in keeping the children's library as a carrot, because it is something that's very popular. I'm hesitant to put it all the way at the end of a project, though, because it's also something that has a dramatic effect on a lot of patrons. So usually we're putting it near the beginning, but we have other priorities here that have been identified as being key. So as we look at these pieces, again, keep in mind that this phase 3, which also includes this space, could be broken out in different ways as well. Now, the reason we're talking about this today is if you might say, for example, wait a minute, we definitely want to do the children's library early as possible. It should be part of one of the phase 2 sections. We can talk about that. But for now, I have it here. So as a reminder, phase 1, the master plan phase 1 is essentially identified as the large meeting room and the vestibule on Delaware, and then the house demo is in this, and of course the site work related to it. Because this addition got larger than the last time we talked, and it includes a little more site work than the last time we had done a budget. We had originally tried to keep this around 3 million. It's a little over 4 million now if we do all of these components plus the renovations in here and the site work. I did include in the lump sum for the site work related to the plaza an electric snow melt system. That's my preference over a hydronic system. Hydronic being one that pipes a heated liquid under the walkway, but it's also higher maintenance, more stress on the boiler, and when things go wrong, it's a more difficult thing to fix. The electric one is a little more expensive to run, but you only run it it's thermostatically and humidity controlled, so it's only running when it has to. We've had some success with it. So an electric one is included. A hydronic one would be more expensive and is not included in the numbers unless we took it out of the design contingency. But you can see we've got plaza, we've got the demo of the house, We've got the 2 additions, the large one, which grew. It's 50% larger to get it from 126 people to 200 people. The other addition is roughly the same, and then renovations in these areas. Then we have an FFE, which is the furnishings, fittings, and equipment. And as we've discussed before, I don't think I have to go over it unless you have questions. There are 3 different types of contingency. Escalation is only 2% because you would presume this one happens first, so it's within the next year or two. If it was going to be longer than that, you would extend this to a greater percentage than 2%. Because it's primarily a new addition and work in known areas where things have happened recently, the construction contingency can remain relatively low at 5%. And the design contingency also is fairly simple at 5%. You'll see that's not necessarily the case as we look at more complicated projects. As I move forward, phase 2A, which is again mostly site work and a small addition, that's about a $3.2 million project when all the percentages are added in. So there's a substantial amount of regrading and doing the parking lot, the driveways, the landscaping, getting rid of the knoll that seems to be a point of contention in the middle of the parking area, redoing walkways, and of course building the drive-through. The renovations area is what happens right outside of the addition there to allow that to happen. So there's a small renovated area, and then the addition is small but complicated. That's that piece. And I also anticipate a little bit of hazardous materials remediation in that phase. So about 2.2 million for hard costs. There are some furnishings, particularly with the transaction window. We want to make sure that we have the right storage, shelving, and coordination. And we may want to talk at some point about whether we digitize a system or do things like that. You can see the construction contingency is a little higher because there are unknowns like the knoll and some things that we're not positive what those details may include. And then escalation is a little higher, presuming this is happening not as soon as the phase 1. So overall, this one's at about 3.2 million. So if we recall, phase 1 was 4.3, phase 2A is 3.2, and then phase 2B is that core area that I was mentioning earlier. It has a public component, which is high visibility. It creates meeting spaces. It creates the collection of things and new and popular quick browse, new circulation areas, some offices, and then a lot of back of house spaces. So you can see there's no additions in this phase. It's 2 different types of renovation. The staff area is a little less expensive than the public area. There's more hazardous materials remediation, particularly given the lobby spaces, and then building envelope improvements as well. These are roof and wall conditions and some windows around the perimeter identified in the physical conditions survey. So hard costs are at about 1.9 million there. The FFE package, the furnishings, fittings, and equipment, is added in. And then you can see the construction contingency is a little higher, again, because we're getting into potential unknowns if we do work there. And the escalation is at 4% rather than 2%, again, presuming this isn't happening as early as phase 1 would. Now, phase 3, again, it should include this space, and the numbers include this space in the square footage. But there is some miscellaneous site work that still has to be taken care of that wasn't in the earlier packages, but could be moved there. There are renovations to the remaining 18,000 square feet, but I did not include any renovations on the mezzanine at this stage. That was identified at an early one as like a phase 4 or 5 or 6. It's so far out there that I thought, to keep things simple, let's just look at the ground floor. We can use that space upstairs as storage or as additional staff space as we move along, but I did not include numbers to actually renovate it. So there's another 2,432 square feet. Remember that the difficulty with renovating that mezzanine area is primarily the inherent structure of it, because it has those posts. If we get into that, that means we also have to substantially change the collection on the level below. So this ends up being about, for the whole rest of it, if it's all done at once, another 4 million, a substantial FFE package. Although I think this number is probably heavy at this point. By the time we've done the other renovation pieces, which have some of the more expensive FFE components, this could probably be lowered closer to $30 a square foot rather than 38. We just got numbers back for the package at Guilderland, and that whole thing is like 790,000, give or take, for the pieces that Megan and I were talking about. That's not the whole thing. But this is only 18,000 square feet. So it tells me that this is a conservative number. We've got plenty of room here and we can actually probably tighten it up. Design and construction. And I put escalation at 8% because this obviously, if we're breaking this into pieces, is substantially out there. It's not just around the corner. At that point, this is at about 6.7 if you did all those other pieces at once. Now, you don't have to do all of them, or you could do some and defer others, or you could take pieces of this and combine them with the earlier phases. So just as a summary, there is about 6,500 gross square feet of addition by the time all of this is done. There was about 20, almost 30,000 net square feet of renovated area, which does not include the mezzanine, but the footprint of the building. And the total, if you take each of these phases, keeping in mind that the escalation percentages are different for each of them, is at about 17 million. Now, you'll recall that we had an earlier estimate when we were looking at all those pieces that added up to about 14.3 million if we were doing it all at once. So this additional cost is about $3 million. It's two things. One is the breaking it into pieces and therefore losing the efficiency of scale. But the second, and multiple mobilizations and so forth. But the second component of that is the inflation as well. That some of that is then extending out. So you have the economy of scale, the inflation, and the third part is we're doing much more once we added the drive-through transaction window and the changes to the site that weren't anticipated earlier. We substantially increased the site costs from what they had been. There was always some site monies, but that increased. So those three factors take us from 14 million to about 17 million altogether. Now, this number, if we looked at all these numbers together, would reduce probably not the full 3 million, but probably about 2 million if you tried to do it all as one scope. So you'd probably be around 15 million, 15.25 million if you tried to do it all at once as a single scope. It would save about $2 million overall. That may not be feasible for your community, and that's something to discuss politically. But does the way I broke this out make sense to you in terms of understanding? And then we'll talk about whether you like that set of phases and set of numbers, or whether we should be moving things around so that individual numbers become more palatable at different stages. Any comments?
Oh, Michelle, you're muted.
Yeah, so Paul, I just wondered if we did end up changing the staff office space that's up on the mezzanine level, would that then affect everything below? So say we were going to do it at a later date. All this is done, yay! And then at a later date we decide to do the staff area. Would we then have construction costs for any of the space below?
The area beneath that mezzanine, that's up in the air. Structurally, we would be changing the things above it, presuming we're trying to get rid of all of those columns. That's the main obstruction to the efficient use of that space. It's conceivable that we could find a different way to support the roof by supplementing with less columns and leave the structure below it and leave it unchanged. But the intention I would think would be that you would at some stage want to look at doing this and the space above it at the same time. If we were trying to get rid of the column stacks in here, then I would say let's renovate the upstairs at the same time and make that usable, because you're modifying that same structure. But if you decided, hey, we're already at 17 million and we don't want to spend more, to renovate the mezzanine on top of that, this is a viable thing that we can leave in place down here and supplement upstairs by getting rid of the columns and doing something simpler.
Would we have sunk, basically, would we have sunk a large pot of money into the downstairs area of that renovation? I mean, I guess that would be, maybe Michelle, correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm mishearing you, but basically, would that be wasted then if at some point in the, after this phase, they said, oh, let's do the upstairs, how much would we be wasting?
I apologize if I misunderstood. So to clarify my point, at some point, you've got a go, no go decision to make on whether you're going to renovate the mezzanine. And that point is when you decide what you're going to do down here. If you decide you're going to keep this down here, then I would say you're probably keeping the mezzanine too. If you decide that you may want to do the mezzanine, that would be the time when you're doing this lower level. So it's not in phases 1, 2, or maybe even 3. It's way down the road. But yes, I think answering your question, when you decide, you should decide and make that final. You shouldn't renovate beneath it and then later go back and say, oh, now we want to do the upstairs. That would be very wasteful. I don't have a specific number, but it would definitely run in 6 figures, mid 6 figures probably. I'll bet 500,000 would be wasted by trying to get rid of the columns downstairs and modify those stacks, and then later come back and try and redo the upstairs.
Okay, so this phase 3, where you have the stacks down below, and it's highlighted in phase 3, but there is no change there. Is that correct?
What I'm saying, for the way we've got phase 3, because we're not doing the mezzanine, I would leave that intact the way it is and live with the stacks as they were originally installed.
All right.
Right. Unless we, again, I'm always conscious of this number, which is scary, even though you're not probably doing it all at once. But if we do say, yes, we definitely want to change those stacks, then I would add that to phase 3, that we're also redoing the mezzanine above it. Or make a decision, we're not doing the mezzanine, but we still want to change the stacks. Now, the other thing I didn't even bother, remember at one point we even showed another addition out here. So I took that off the table as well. It's either so far in the future or so far over what a palatable number is that, we'll include it in the report as something for future expansion or something that was discussed, but it didn't seem like it had any traction as something that would happen in the next, several iterations of this board of trustees or generations of Bethlehem residents for now.
But for the phase 3 as described here, the underneath part of the mezzanine would mostly be carpeting, painting, right? Structurally, there's not a lot of,
right.
So if you say we leave this now, we're not. If you just did a 3 sort of as conceptually imagined here, that doesn't preclude some future board from saying, oh, by the way, what you basically sunk into that space was carpeting, a little bit of furnishings, that kind of stuff, and they could deal with that.
That's true. Yes. We're not structurally changing anything. There could be a capital project 20 years in the future where they do decide to rip all that out. And as you say, you've lost some ceiling, some carpeting, some paint. But the complication is I wouldn't want to try and get into changing that now unless you are also doing the mezzanine. And if you're also doing the mezzanine, the numbers just keep creeping up. But to your point, you're right. The numbers that are included here aren't sinking a fortune into it. It's basic stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So, Paul, what is driving the cost of phase 3? Is it just the cosmetic items?
Phase 3 is the essentially being driven by the scale of it. It's almost 19,000 square feet of building. If you think of that, that's a substantial amount of square feet. So at $225, we're talking about not just aesthetic things, but revising the mechanical system, improving its efficiency, revising power distribution and data distribution throughout that space as well, to bring it more into term with a 21st century library. So that renovation is not just those cosmetic things over 18,000 square feet, but it's also all the other things that make the library run and comfortable. So as you get into 18,000 square feet, cosmetics is certainly one piece, but you know, the mechanical system alone is probably $50 a square foot out of that.
Okay, I think I got it. And I guess one follow-up question then for phase 1 and phase 2. So what is the improvement to curbside for phase 1? Are we not touching it at all? Or is there a small improvement to the building?
In phase 1, we've brought the entry closer, but we did not do anything at this end for that addition yet. That would be, I've broken that out into phase 2A or 2B. So yes, it's brought this closer, and there's the potential that we could build in a desk or a reception area in the lobby that makes it easier to do curbside drop or pickup on a temporary basis until the transaction window is done. But no, there's nothing specific toward the curbside model in phase 1. Phase 1 is primarily the meeting room and the lobby and just the site work around it. It is a larger meeting room than previously discussed. As I mentioned, it grew 50%. And you can see in the numbers that that's the largest single driving factor is that addition.
Got it. Okay.
Oh, I just wanted to ask whether it, and I know we've talked about the large meeting room a lot, but does it make sense at this point to possibly flip phase 1 to 2A and move the renovation for the window, and also possibly move, obviously you would have to move the demolition of the house as part of that, but
Right.
Does it make sense to look at that and then do the larger meeting room as the second phase?
That's a programmatic question, and Jeff and the staff are probably best suited to answer it. I would say though, that feels to me like a lot of money to spend on what we know are improvements that are good and even in service, but it's not going to be as noticeable to the public as the meeting room would be. That's my outside opinion, but Jeff and staff, you guys should give your thoughts on what you hear at the desk every day.
I mean, we're not even using a meeting room right now, so and I realize we're a number of years out on how many phases this is, but
well, that's an interesting point. And let me come back to something Harmeet said then. Did we improve curbside delivery? If this is not to be used as a large congregation space for meetings, then it is a more proximate location to do curbside pickup. Right here in Greenwich at our library, we took the community room, which obviously isn't being used for programming right now, and it became the staging area for delivery outside to curbside and for queuing. They separate all the return stuff and keep it a certain number of days in quarantine before it goes back into the collection. So maybe Harmeet, I jumped too quickly because I was assuming this being used as a meeting room. And again, we're talking about it being constructed not this summer, but at least a couple summer or two from now. By then, hopefully we're not in pandemic mode. But if that was the case and curbside pickup was a situation, that is a good staging area for it. So that's a good point, Lisa, to Harmeet's comment, is that as we change the nature of our serving, it does have some potential there. Just like that was going to be potentially the queuing space or the staging space as we renovated other areas.
I mean, it also means that you limp along with what our current curbside setup is for quite a while.
I mean, we're going to be limping along with the current curbside setup for quite a while, even if that got moved to phase one. So,
Right.
you know, I absolutely appreciate that. I don't, you know, and what I think it could be a decent discussion for us to have about, you know, what of that phase 2A could be done in phase one, along with, I mean, just sort of, from a larger perspective, and I'm going to imagine a post-pandemic perspective, the biggest need, in my opinion, that the community demands of the library that we can't meet is the large meeting room, you know, and the accessibility of meeting space in the library. And it's hard for me to think about that when for a year there have been no meetings. And that's just, you know, and, you know, I'm not immune to those thoughts because it's, it's not a piece of our business that we have not done in so long. I never thought this would go on for a year, and it's going to go on for another 6 months minimum.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but that makes it difficult to have the conversation. But I still think, you know, if we can assume that we're operating normally, then, you know, my chip would always go down on creating a large meeting room for the public, both for our program. You know, that's you know, far more complaints about, I can't get my kids into the program you're having at the time I want to attend it than anything else, you know. And I think we'll, you know, we'll have to observe as we exit this current phase in our reopening plan, how in-person browsing, as people get more and more comfortable coming into the library, how that affects total curbside numbers. In the beginning, it won't. We observed that last time. Curbside will be just as busy, and will eventually that just ease down to a point where it could be, you know, a relatively small number of people who are have a compelling reason to want to use curbside. Anyway, that's all. Sorry.
That's an interesting point, Jeff. In some ways, you're paying a political cost now, or you were up until this changed, by patrons or people in your chartered to serve area being frustrated by not being able to take advantage of the services you actually offered because they were booked so quickly. So, you know, we think in terms of the costs of moving forward with things, you're paying a cost now because of the way things are, because of the amount of meeting room space that's available.
Yeah, that limit, that hard limit that we have of about 90 people. You know, I'm trying to, again, the previous 19 years of my existence here, I try to imagine, you know, what did people want to do? You know, it was that we ran up against a 90-person limit on that meeting room, and there were lots of adult programs and children's programs and even meetings that community groups wanted to hold, that number, you know, I think about the Bethlehem Senior Choir. There's 40 people in the choir alone. That leaves only 60 people can come watch. That's not enough, you know. So having a large meeting room like that just opens that all up, both for our programs and their programs. You know, I've said for years that's my priority, but I absolutely understand that, you know, the community has been very clear with us that curbside pickup is not, we're not going to be allowed to phase that out. That it is a desirable service, you know, from a service standpoint, people want it. And, you know, but then if we start talking about adding phase 1 and phase 2A together to do that first phase, that number is going to get pretty big. So.
Yeah, I mean, that ends up being, you know, if you just add those two at 3.2 and 4.3, right? You're at $7.5-8 million, which is, I would say, not an absurd number for a lot of suburban libraries. You know, Guilderland's situation, Colony has certainly spent a lot of money lately, but you are the best judge of what Bethlehem would actually like to see happen. So it's a manageable project to do those two, and it accomplishes a lot of things. The other thing I wanted to mention too, regarding the pandemic and the way we think about health, it's not just this meeting space, but this did include the numbers for creating that outdoor space that ties to the meeting space. So it gives us more options with programming that the doors are open and we're outside or connected in some way. So it does make it a more a safer environment for a lot of programming that might have been nixed if this was the only venue that was available. Whereas here we have a little bit of flexibility, and that is, as I say, built into the cost as well.
So Paul, was there a reason why you put the demo and the house demo in phase 1
To get it out now.
rather than 2?
It doesn't have to happen to allow this to happen, but the longer the building sits there, the more liability it becomes to you potentially as repairs need to be made on it, or somebody gets hurt on the property, or whatever the case may be. I think the safest thing from your perspective is probably to clear it, make sure that's out of the way for future phases, and then take advantage of the additional lawn area, or even a small paving project would add a little bit of parking there too, or even a gravel lot until future things happen. You will face at some point a question about the immunity to taxes on that property, because it's not conjoined to your property now. And if it's an empty building, that's a difficult case to make. Unless you're using it for storage and something specific for library purposes. So
Off-site
Well-
record storage.
Yeah. So, but for now, no, the intent was simply to get that piece out of the way, because I know that had been a concern early on, but that could move easily.
Yeah. I mean, I know we're using it for storage now, and maybe that would be beneficial during any of the phasing, but my other concern is just taking it down and having the empty space is another issue that you have to address.
The empty space where the house was?
Right. Well, they bought that house and took it down, and what are they doing with it?
Oh, I see. Well, it's part of explaining the master plan too, and what the long range plan is, and that it's part of future pieces. But you're right. It can be taken out, but as I say, 80,000 out of 4.3 million isn't the driving factor in that cost. But yes, it could be deferred to phase 2 easily.
I just wasn't sure if it was tied in with the site work or not.
No, it's the opposite side. It's a good question, but no, I think it came more from the fact that all the conversations early on were, shouldn't we be getting rid of that? Shouldn't we be tearing that down? It just seemed like the best part to potentially get it out of the way. But no, it could wait. And if you're using it for storage, maybe it is a good idea to keep it while construction's going on, because contractors also like to have some indoor storage if possible, that's secure, protected from the elements. So that's the potential.
The only thing I'm keeping in my back pocket is if there happens to be a large pool of federal money that comes in, we can move rather quickly on that property as opposed to most of our other property, because it's not owned by the school district. So
that's an excellent point. Yeah, and we are hearing about how the latest relief bill include the potential for monies for library capital projects. So we're keeping an eye on that.
Yep.
All of these, frankly, I mean, it does make us think about the fact that we might plan, we're going to do phase 1 or whatever, some component of phase 1, but it may become remember that phrase that was so popular in the last recession was shovel ready, things, that the ARRA were going to help fund the Recovery Act and so forth. And by having this master plan in place, we could literally say, do we have something shovel ready? Well, look, yeah, we've got exactly here. We know exactly where we're headed and what we're doing. We still have to do the drawings, but it's pretty close. We know where things are. We could take advantage of that. You brought up the point of moving the demo potentially from 1 to 2. Was there anything? It's hard to think of too many things from 2 to move from 2A to move back into 1, because the reason for doing all of the site work is because of the transaction window, and the reason you didn't do the transaction window unless you did all the site work. So that's somewhat self-contained. 2B, however, you could, instead of stopping here, you could start to do some of this. But then we get into some really tricky phasing, because we have to actually think point by point where does staff go when this happens? Where does patron, all of those components have to be worked out in a lot more detail than this conceptual level. But you can see how it might be manageable to move some of these pieces, whereas 2A, which is sort of a self-contained project, has to happen all at once.
Well, in phase one, where are you directing the public into the building?
In phase one, we would have to create temporary entry. Sorry. I should be allowed to touch these things. In phase one, we would emphasize the Delaware Ave entry, but what we might do is try to create a temporary corridor. They do this with schools sometimes. They use a fire retardant plywood, and actually you see it in New York City a lot too. They build scaffolding over an area and essentially a tunnel into where the entry is. We might even try to think about putting in a temporary entry at another wall that then gets filled in later. But obviously all this construction activity is happening closest to the parking lot, which is what made this a good siting for the large meeting room. But it will be difficult in this area. So it's likely that things would come along the building and into a tunnel to get into the.
How far into the lobby are we coming with phase one right now?
Phase one brings us to that set of doors there. Yeah. So it includes this area, but not the, right now that's the
boardroom. Yep.
The studio. Boardroom. So it did not include that renovation yet, but it basically brought us up to the front doors.
Yeah, the second you step past the front doors, we're into the ceiling, the popcorn ceiling in the hallway, which
out here, and that's why we avoided it in this phase. Yeah.
Yep.
And you can see when you get to the cost estimates. Yeah, when we get to phase 2B, there's 6 figures of hazardous materials there, in addition to 6 figures in earlier phase in other pieces too. So
yeah, I guess generally I'm in agreement, Jeff, with your point on phase one and the meeting room being the highest priority item for the public. I think the way this is scheduled right now, and then just maybe my timing is wrong. If this is 2 or 3 years away for phase one, then phase two is again another 2 or 3 years away, right? That seems like a long way to not have any improvement to our curbside arrangement, right? Which is kind of ad hoc right now. So it was maybe we need to find a way to do something a little homegrown, right? Like we were talking about a canopy or something similar,
right?
Right. It's not 6 figures anymore, but it's some sort of improvement to that. Yep. To make it a little more permanent if we are going to have to, to sustain it for 5 more years.
Yeah.
Well, there's nothing, well, I shouldn't say there's nothing, but it would be possible. There's no law against it to not do phase 1, 2, 3. We could do a phase 1 that's 1 and 2, and exactly. Then 3, yes. Only if obviously the public goes for it. Because right. I agree with Harmeet. We all know that the meeting room is very important, but if that's the only thing we add, people are going to walk in the library and they're going to say, "What's changed? Nothing's changed. There's nothing different here." And then too, as a second point, and Paul, I know you already spoke to this, but having the children's library at the very end of this entire process, so 6, 8 years from now, I don't know how long that would be. I just remember that the children's library was also high up on that list of priorities for the public. So it does worry me a little bit that the children's library would be pushed off all the way to the end.
I don't disagree, but we can shuffle one thing or another, but at some point the piper has to be paid, I guess. And so the question is, I can take some things from 2B here. A lot of that has to happen at once, because rearranging where staff are and stuff in these areas, a lot of those have to make up for each other. There's more freedom in the third phase because it's a bigger scope, but it also has a lot of different things going on. We can take a piece out and add it. So for example, take the children's room and make that part of an earlier phase. But it worried me looking at it that this is at 18,000 and almost 19,000 square feet. This is the majority of the library. And as you say, it doesn't get touched until phase 3, not because I don't want to, but because I was trying to make sure that phases 1 and 2 were actually manageable from a number perspective. So either we have to think bigger and fundraise and grant write and probably referendum to get a substantial project to make a lot happen in a single phase, or we're going to deal with what you just said, that some precious babies may be deferred a little further along than we would want them to.
So am I reading this correctly to say if you did the whole project, it's like a $15 million project?
Give or take. Yes,
Okay.
exactly. I mentioned
Yeah.
if you total what I have here, it's at 17.3. It
Yeah.
wouldn't get us all the way back to 14.2, but it'd probably get us back to about 15.2.
Okay.
That's correct.
I mean, that still would take a bunch of years, right? I mean, say if you said, let's do the whole project, let's do the bond, go do whatever, fundraise. And then when you say go, you're still probably, in order to operate a library and do the project, you're still going to be at least a year or two, right?
What would happen if you passed a referendum and the day after the referendum passes, we start working on the construction documents to
Right.
get it ready to submit? Because you're a school district library and you have SCD review capacity, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
So that means we're going to need 6 to 8 months to put the documents together, submit them to state ed. It'll take at least 2 to 4 months. For a while, it was much longer than that. It's back down to a normal range. But yes, you've just spent a year from the referendum date to the production of the construction documents, the review by state ed. You've spent a year before you bid it.
Right.
Then you probably have, if you were doing this all at once, you probably have 18 months of construction,
Mhm.
18 to 20 months. So yeah, you're 2.5 years from the referendum date before there's a ribbon cutting if you did it all at once. Now, sometimes you can get a partial, what's called a temporary CO, a TCO, or a partial, to reopen part of the building, but it's a substantial undertaking, as you can imagine.
Right.
But that's a good point. It's not like the referendum passes and the next day we're on the street with a bid.
Right.
We've been asked in some occasions to do the construction documents because they were so confident that the referendum would pass, but that's a pretty big risk that I wouldn't take as a board member.
Right.
That's a lot of money to pay an architect, and then if it doesn't pass, you've got a useless set of drawings. So generally the schedule is, we would begin right after the referendum. So the other thing, if we're doing this in a single large project, we would want to consider it would still probably be constructed in stages. And if any of you have followed what we're doing in Guilderland, that's a similar, the addition was built sort of first and we're moving things around because of it. So that kind of staging would still happen. They just wouldn't be separate phases of a project like we're talking about here, which are phased because of the funding mechanism, not phased because of any other construction priority.
Right.
So perhaps you folks want to think about these. I mean, to me, that's the most important question. Are we trying to consolidate? Are we willing to make a couple of the numbers bigger to get more things up front? Or do I maybe even need to thread it out even a little more to make some of the numbers smaller, which of course stretches time. But in order to complete the report, in order to complete the master plan, I sort of want to have an accurate reflection of what the committee may be thinking, because the variables are infinite here. Do I put this here? Do I put that there? At some point you just sort of have to say, this is the general direction. We'll figure out those details as we get there. But I wanted you to see the numbers so that you could see where you felt about those.
Well, Paul, I thank you for that. I think it's important to have, sort of the scope of the numbers, because I think that, there's a very political question that happens now, along with, wants are infinite, right? We want, every piece of this I could use tomorrow. But when it comes down to actually prioritizing, I mean, we can hear just what we have here.
Yep.
A lot of hard questions. So.
Absolutely true. And again, the other option is, I hate to suggest it, but you could conceivably say, we just want to renovate a bunch of these areas at a less expensive project, of course, not at 6.7 million, but get by with the mechanical system that's there, get by with the electrical system that's there, fix up the aesthetics and so forth in the body of the library, and then hope that in the future we can develop some of these other ideas. But keep in mind, those other ideas weren't from around our table. They came from the public. We did a lot of due diligence in asking and trying to listen to those things. So I like to think that we didn't go way beyond the pale when it came to what we were dreaming of here. It's just a question of how we managed to fund it. I don't think there's anything extraneous here, but feel free to disagree. If somebody says there's no way we need the ice cream bar or the, whatever else we've got in there. I'm joking. Obviously we're streaming live, but there may be features here that aren't a first priority that could be deferred. But at some point we're really just talking about these ballpark numbers and how we feel about how we put them together with a fundraising campaign, a grant writing campaign, and or a referendum campaign. And for that, I'm going to need a little direction. Happy to continue to discuss it, but I've sort of said, I guess, what I can say about it until you think about it a little bit and we get back on it.
All right. Well, we're coming in on 5. So let's, I think we need a little thinking time and, and maybe some discussions. We can think about this a little bit and we'll come back to you. We'll get back pretty quickly and we want to get this thing wrapped up. So, we're there. I think we just need to think about what the priorities are.
And I know I say this all, but it's absolutely true. Whenever you need me, let me know. I'm happy to enter a conversation. If an idea jumps up and could we do this and that, I'm happy to have a conversation with you about it as we go along. So there are lots of possibilities. I don't want you to feel like I just dumped this in your lap and you let me know, but I feel like I've given you sort of as much as we can give you at the moment. When you give us some feedback, we can try and think some more about it, and we're happy to participate in clarifying anything you need along the way. All right, and then we can wrap up the report, make the final presentation, whether remotely or in person, and start thinking about what the next steps would be, depending on what those funding mechanisms are in those pieces. So, okay.
Great.
Well, thank you all for your time on a busy Friday. Stay safe, everybody.
Okay, thanks,
Thank
Paul.
you.
Thank you, Paul.
I'll try and stop sharing here. I don't know if you folks are going to stick around in the meeting. I'm going to excuse myself unless anybody needs me.
All right. Thanks, Paul.
Bye.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
All right. Should we adjourn?
Jeff, I had a really, really quick question. I
Yeah.
didn't want to waste Paul's time. Do these plans address the staff's wish list, I guess you would say? I'm a little worried that we haven't improved any staff space.
Somewhat, but not, in that phase 2B, as I look at it.
Okay.
It's certainly better. Without the mezzanine project and something to address the mezzanine, there's a lot that it's going to be no, partially yes, for part of the staff, yes, and for another significant part of the staff, no, because they work upstairs, right? So, even in this phase 3 is currently conceived, that doesn't, because that's just, it takes that number and sets it up to 20 something, in scope. And it addresses some, certainly the curbside window. I think that would make some significant improvements, having that workspace down at the far end of that hallway where you had some actual room there. So even if people had to trade back and forth between sort of the main circulation area. Let me, I can share this out here. That's not what I want to do. No, I don't want that.
I did see a staff break room and
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely improvement. So I don't want to say no, it doesn't. But this phase, if you're looking at, I think we're looking at phase 2B here. A lot of these improvements move some of the staff this way, and there's we've grabbed some of the public floor space here for the staff. So there's definitely some more room back here for staff people. And then it's not that far from, well, we don't have a close in, but basically this space. And then in grabbing, in this addition here, which is this place you usually would see the van parked, sometimes just sort of outside next to the staff entrance, you've created new space there, just sort of squared that rectangle off and made some new space for maintenance. And then in this phase, because the maintenance office shrinks, there's more staff space. And that's where that staff break room goes. So I think maybe I spoke too quickly. There's some significant improvements for the staff. As far as the size of the meeting room, the amenities of the meeting room, I think there's some improvements there. Certainly in this space, there's definitely more room in this area for the staff compared to where it is now. But the whole plan absolutely does not address the staff that work up here, and that's just. We've been talking about it for 20 years. You just keep running up against this hard wall every time you say, let's get rid of those poles. It seems so easy, and it just keeps taking that cost right through the roof.
okay, thanks.
So
I do want to mention that the large meeting room would address the staff having to turn people away all of the time,
thank you.
Increasing that large meeting room to 200. If there's ever a time we can get 200 people in that meeting room again, would alleviate a lot of the times that staff have to say no. And that's not fun.
Yeah,
Thank you, Catherine. That's important.
good.
Maybe it makes sense to look at this, and as people were talking previously, make it just 2 phases and split things,
I mean, so my fear is always,
library up, move the curbside up,
all the, I guess my fear, and maybe I shouldn't be driven by fear. My fear is always that we're going to get one bite at the apple. What's the tolerance? And that's where this becomes a very political question. So your thoughts are important on this. If you get one bite at the apple, what's the bite you want to take? Because I fear sometimes if we go out for a referendum for a $4 million project, the public's going to be like, we gave you your $4 million.
Right.
Right. And to clarify why I made that other suggestion regarding flipping is some of it is the price tag, and some of it is, that we bought that building a while ago, and there's I think a limited amount of time that people are like waiting for us to do something with it. So and just knocking it down isn't what people want to see.
Well, the last time we knocked down 2 houses, people really did like having that big piece of lawn. They loved it out there. So so I don't want to say, I'm in no way arguing with you, because I think you're right. But having a certain amount of green space where there was a building, people did not hate. For a while, the garden club was holding its plant sale there, and when we made it into a parking lot, they were sad to see it go. So, there is some value to that. I think gravel parking lot is probably not what I would say this is a good idea, because having some nice green space for a public event or even a tent or some kind of thing, I think could be quite a positive. But I'm doing a lot of talking, so I want to. So do we want to meet again? You want to think about this and then we meet quickly and then go back with Paul?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So let's, if that sounds like a good idea, we'll get that scheduled, but we'll adjourn this meeting, and then we'll schedule up another meeting. We can talk, think about this. It's a lot of information. Numbers are large, and then get back together and talk about this pretty quickly and get back with Paul and get this thing put to bed.
Sounds good.
Okay, thanks.
All right. So if someone wants to let us escape, someone needs to make a motion in a second to adjourn.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
All right.
I think
Pardon
Mark
me?
was first. I'll second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Thanks, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Have a
Talk
good
soon.
weekend.
You too.
Thank you.